With the first half of the decade now being a prospect of hindsight, how is the lucky country faring in the contemporary era? Is the land down under doing well, or is it backsliding on all myriad of economic and other developmental measures? The answer is surprising, as Australia sustained the largest backslide in disposable household income between 2021 and 2024, amounting to an 8% total decline. While the rest of the world recovered, Australia was one of only 2 countries in the developed world to sustain such a further decline in disposable income. Furthermore, income from financial assets has more than halved as a source of household income between the start of 2022 and the end of 2024, while, since the end of 2022, labour income growth rates have stagnated precipitously. And additionally, inflation as per the Consumer Price Index remained at 3.8% going into January of 2026. These are relevant figures. Above the target range of 3%, mind you, with that goal only forecasted to be reached by June 2027, ceteris paribus. But with global events and Australia's high dependency on the global economy, who knows how well we can forecast into the future? Australia's balance of trade, for instance, reflecting the dollar amount of value credited to the Australian economy largely by Australian firms selling to the outside world, has dropped precipitously as well since 2022, peaking then at a record 19.1 billion Australian dollars, now only at 2.63 billion dollars in January 2026. This highlights both a much greater proportional dependency on the global economy for imports, and decreasing value of our exports against global competitors. This reflects an economy where financial investment is no longer profitable, and working a job merely sustains you. It doesn't get you ahead. Australia, economically speaking, is falling behind the rest of the world. So, with the power of hindsight, the 2020s have thus far been a period of financial loss for the Australian people.
Melbourne is today in its 235th day of shutdown since the pandemic began, officially making it the city to have endured the world's longest lockdown.
On democracy and freedom, however, the other side of the coin, aside from economics, Australia started the decade notoriously with systematic attacks on its own people's civil liberties as a response to COVID-19. Human Rights Watch reported in 2022 that Australia has restricted the rights of its own citizens to enter and to leave their own country. Stay-at-home orders, mask mandates, mandatory quarantine, school and work restrictions, among other general restrictions on everyday life, marked much of the world's entry into the 2020s, not just Australia. As such, it would be unfair to characterize an abnormal event as a standard of Australian democracy, nor an index for how we might ascertain future levels of freedom in Australian society. In fact, the 2010s itself saw major backslides on trends towards declining political corruption and increasing government accountability, fortunately, which since the 2020s have re-emerged in the previously trending direction. Nevertheless, concerns around fundamental tenets of a free and open society, such as freedom of expression, still ought to be raised in light of new laws passed, such as the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism, Criminal and Migration Laws Act, which has been described by some parliamentarians opposed to the bill as a chilling attack on political debate, protest and civil rights. Or in Queensland, for instance, the Fighting Anti-Semitism and Keeping Guns Out of the Hands of Terrorists and Criminals Amendment Bill, which now sees Queenslanders who use the phrase "from the river to the sea," among other phrases, face up to 2 years imprisonment. This has already caused pro-Palestinian protesters to get arrested, such as the student protester who stated that she didn't even know that the phrase had been banned, in reference to "from the river to the sea." Regardless of whether you align with Palestinians, the capacity of the government to criminalize legitimate political protest, such as this young lady who is clearly not a terrorist seeking a firearm, ought to be checked by our political processes. So given the multitude of considerations regarding a dire economic outlook, without having even mentioned the housing crisis, which for my Australian viewers needs no introduction, and a relatively stable yet nonetheless problematic political climate with democracy and freedom, which political party should we look forward to electing? Firstly, the political organisations covered by the consideration of this video are the Australian Labor Party, the Liberal National Coalition, One Nation, and the Greens. According to polling as recent as March 2026, these are the four political organisations within Australia which have support of at least greater than 10% of the Australian population, and thus lesser parties will not be considered. Sorry, libertarians. Secondly, when considering the fundamental philosophy of any of these parties, we will consider their self-identity towards any political philosophy, definitions of such philosophy, any evidence for their subjective interpretation of such philosophy, and how well their policies actually align with their self-described philosophy. Accordingly, when viewing the Australian Labor Party, their fundamental political philosophy is as self-described according to the National Constitution, being that of a democratic socialist party, with the objective of the democratic socialization of industry, production, distribution, and exchange, to the extent necessary to eliminate exploitation and other antisocial features in these fields. This has been a formally espoused position for over a century, with the adoption of the socialist objective within Labour's national platform for the first time in 1921. And furthermore, from 1966 to 2014, the ALP were officially associated with the Socialist International, and now they continue to be associated with the Progressive Alliance, which was formed due to international criticism of the Socialist International's admittance and inclusion of anti-democratic political movements into the organisation. So, the Australian Labor Party self-describes as a democratic socialist party and has frequently associated with purely socialist organisations. But what does this actually mean? While not all socialist adjacent, and democratic socialist thought stems from Karl Marx, as the field's undoubtedly most impactful thinker, his definition of socialism as being a transitional stage between capitalism and communism, whereby a dictatorship of the proletariat pursues egalitarian outcomes towards a new classless society, certainly reflects aspects of the self-described origin of the Labour Party. And using a quote from their own national constitution, they seek to forward the struggle of the working class against the excesses, injustices, and inequalities of capitalism. And this, therefore, provides a dimension to which we must evaluate Labour. Does the party actually seek to transition Australia beyond a capitalist society? In addition to Marx's definition, the Merriam-Webster dictionary states that socialism is defined as any of various egalitarian economic and political theories or movements advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and the distribution of goods. Therefore, a political party such as Labour, which pursues egalitarian outcomes through governmental administration over the economy, might well fall under this socialist umbrella. If we are to make an attempt to quantify what makes a country socialist, democratic socialist, or capitalist, one might consider, in light of these definitions from Marx and Merriam-Webster, the state of economic freedom. Fundamentally, in a socialist economy, government regulations underlie every facet of production towards mandated egalitarian outcomes. In other words, government authority is used to rid society of class distinctions. However, Australia scored the Heritage Foundation's fourth place with respect to the most economically free societies in the year 2026. This is while we are under Anthony Albanese's Labour government. Contrast this with the same study stating that North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela, all being socialist countries, were all respectively the bottom three economies with respect to economic freedom. Therefore, according to the party's policies platform in 2025, the following aims of new cost of living tax cuts for every Australian, more tax relief for small businesses, supporting small businesses toward opening Australia up to new markets, delivering energy bill relief and the instant asset write-off for small businesses, and other policies are all aims which stated to either be achieved already or to be currently pursued, are contradictory to Marx's definition of socialism, because it emboldens capitalism to any extent. However, these are among policies stated, such as the ban on supermarket price gouging, offering student debt relief, financial support to parents, investing in renewable energy, which all reflect government involvement in the market economy and are in line with redistributive economic measures. Ultimately, the synthesis of both pro-small business policies and economic freedom side by side with a substantive list of government intervention in economic affairs means that the Australian Labor Party can be considered neither strictly socialist or capitalist. Both socialism and its distinction of democratic socialism must encompass a desire to at some point transition away from capitalism, whether through Marx's prescribed dictatorship of the proletariat or by virtue of democratic means. Labour's policies are certainly emblematic of both socialism and democratic socialism in regard to the extent that they meddle in the economy. Therefore, Labour falls more toward a social democratic party, described in short by Merriam-Webster as a democratic welfare state that incorporates both capitalist and socialist practices, where, according to Klaus F. Zimmermann, free market excesses are tempered by the government. To further reiterate the distinctions between democratic socialism and now social democracy, democratic socialists are committed to the systemic transformation of the economy from capitalism, while social democrats use capitalism to create a strong welfare state. Id est, social democrats utilize government power to address what they consider social issues and inequalities without neglecting the engine of capitalism, whereas democratic socialists seek to transform the economy entirely beyond capitalism. If Labour was committed to a socialist economy by strict definition, we would not have such strong economic freedom in Australia as we currently do under their leadership, nor would they have any policies whatsoever that benefit any privately owned businesses, even if only small businesses. However, something of an underappreciated fact of Australian politics is that there are factional divisions within the parties, with long-running histories and tangible existences that go beyond just mere labels and rhetoric. And no, I do not mean the coalition, for instance, being two separate parties under one banner. Instead, it is much deeper than that. For instance, Labour left is not just a term applied to the more ideologically inclined members of the overall ALP. It is a membership-based organisation with official publications and policy positions. This, in combination with the fact that there is a complementary counterpart untoward Labour left, the Labour right faction, which is every bit as real and structured as Labour left, exists as the more moderate of leftist positions. To decry, criticize, or even hope for Labour to be a democratic socialist or otherwise socialist political party is to take a perspective wholly ignorant of this Labour right faction. We Australians tend to forget just how factionally divided politics can even be within a party. I think a quote from Arthur Calwell, the federal leader for Labour from 1960 to 1967, can articulate the degree to which in reality internal political party politics are highly divided. He said, "I've witnessed 3 disastrous splits in the Australian Labor Party during the past 56 years. He served for a long time. Further, the first split occurred in 1916 over conscription in World War I, the second in 1931 over the Premier's plans for economic recovery in the Great Depression, and the third in 1955 over alleged communist infiltration of the trade union movement." I use this as an example to evidence just how intellectually dishonest and inaccurate it is to label all of Labour as being of one nature, and one nature only. All in all, the Australian Labor Party has done itself a massive disservice by adopting the self-proclaimed ideological position of being democratic socialist, to which critics insist the whole modus operandi of the party is predicated upon. This is regarded by the most staunch of critics as being of the same Marxian socialist outlooks and positions that caused the worst of the atrocities of the latter half of the 20th century. While I personally do not align with Labour, this rhetorical degradation of the entirety of Labour as socialist is just not true, and such use of rhetoric diminishes the quality of political discussion in Australia. The party's national platform is the best synthesis of all these viewpoints into a singularity. However, despite still honouring the socialist objective, quote, the consequence of federal leadership under the ALP nevertheless falls entirely short of the definition of socialism, as there is no grand social transformation. Ultimately, the Australian Labor Party is functionally as follows: an alliance of the majority of mainstream leftist thought in Australian politics, predominantly led by social democrats, alongside a vast array of other leftist and centre-left positions, such as trade unionists, Keynesianists, social progressivists, and yes, some socialists. The verdict is that they're social democrats. Right in the very name of the Liberal National Coalition states a political philosophy, liberal, referring to what the Liberal Party's founder, Sir Robert Menzies, tied to classical liberalism. It should be pretty straightforward then, right? In his writings, Menzies asserted that the basic philosophy of Australian liberalism is that the prime duty of government is to encourage enterprise, to provide a climate favourable for its growth, to remember that it is the individual whose energies produce progress, and that all social benefits derive from the individual's efforts. This is continued rhetorically in the current incarnation of the Liberal Party, with their federal constitution, as adopted in 2017, stating that the primary duty of their leadership is to do everything in their power to stimulate the progress of liberalism in Australia, by adhering to the primary objective of having an Australian nation, quote, dedicated to political liberty and the freedom and dignity of man, namely, by respecting separation of the judiciary, freedom of speech, freedom of religion and association, as well as the freedom of citizens to, quote, choose their own way of living subject to the rights of others. This is fairly succinct to the Webster's Dictionary definition of classical liberalism being, quote, a political philosophy based on the belief that freedom of the individual is paramount and that government's role should be largely limited to protecting that freedom. So, to compartmentalize all of this information down, the Liberal Party espouses rhetoric that they are an organization committed to individuals' freedoms and liberties to live their own lives without transgressing upon the freedom of others. Perfectly liberal within an Enlightenment era understanding of the philosophy of liberalism. However, if we look at their coalition counterparts, the Nationals, we see in their primary object of the party, according to their national constitution, their goal is to, quote, promote within Australia a society based on Christian ethics and loyalty to the Crown. At the very heart of the coalition seems therefore to be an intrinsic values-based difference on fundamental stances alone, as one cannot reasonably reconcile the compromising existence between Christian monarchists and classical liberals who seek to themselves maintain freedom of religion in Australian society. A critic of my critique may argue that Christian ethics does not mean that the Australian people are to be compelled into membership of the Christian faith. And furthermore, Section 116 of the Constitution states that the Commonwealth shall not make any law for establishing any religion or for imposing any religious observance or for prohibiting the free exercise of any religion. Nevertheless, the object of the National Party has so far manifested in political measures by the coalition which seemingly contradict the Liberals' own position that classical liberalism seeks to allow others to, quote, choose their own ways of living. A clear analysis of the Christian agenda within the Liberal National Coalition involves looking at the $30 million expected cost per annum of school chaplaincies under the National Student Wellbeing Program, which provisions pastoral jobs for an overwhelmingly Christian amount of chaplains in our school, disproportionately representing 98.52% of all school chaplains, compared to only 63.89% of the Australian population being Christian upon the introduction of this program in 2006. This certainly suggests that since at least the time of John Howard's leadership, the LNP has been closer aligned to the National Party's Christian values rather than classical liberalism. While merely funding an almost exclusively Christian project in our nation's education system is not strictly incompatible with liberalism, as it does not involve coercion, force, or duress, it certainly is at odds with the fundamental tenet of live and let live, so associated with what it means to be a classical liberal. Increasingly, the Liberal Party seems to be liberal in name only. This is not only present in one controversial program, but has been omnipresent in the coalition continuously in contemporary politics. For example, under the leadership of Scott Morrison, an explanatory memorandum Morrison personally submitted to Parliament for his proposed religious discrimination bill, which ultimately was shelved, explained within it that, under the bill, it would not be discrimination for religious primary schools to require all of its staff and students to practice that religion. After the election of Anthony Albanese, the Daily Declaration, self-confessed to be Australia's largest Christian news site, saw journalist James McPherson recollect on the initial election of Scott Morrison in hindsight, stating that Morrison was Australia's first out-and-out evangelical Prime Minister. He came to office thanks to a miracle election result, and Christians rejoiced. Hallelujah. If the Liberal National Coalition was more liberal than Christian nationalist, one would expect the Liberal candidate for Prime Minister should not evoke the description of being an out-and-out evangelical Prime Minister, worthy of hallelujahs nonetheless, and according to McPherson, worthy of causing atheists to be full of dread upon his election. Ultimately, with application to social issues, James Madison, a hallmark figure within the philosophy of classical liberalism for having co-authored the United States Constitution, stated in his book, From Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments in 1785, quote, "Who does not see the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions, may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion to all other sects?" End quote. The same can apply with any religion. To pursue a religious agenda, even if strictly not imposing the establishment of strict religious adherence mandated by law and therein by force, is to renege on centuries of classical liberal philosophy. As an aside, to evidence why the Liberal Party fails in its adherence to liberal philosophy, while not being theocratic or authoritarian in nature, yet nevertheless ought not to be deemed liberal in nature either, consider this. If anarchy is defined as the organization of society on the basis of voluntary cooperation, without political institutions or hierarchical government, then it is not strictly anti-anarchist to own a business which only serves white people at the behest of all other races. However, even if this were to happen within an anarchist system, you would certainly not classify that business person as being an anarchist, would you? Very much in the same light, if the Liberal Party pursues Christian ethics, reforms education disproportionately in favor of Christians, and even pursued religious homogeneity in certain workplaces, even with the absence of government force in practice, it cannot be considered liberal by its very nature. However, regardless of whether or not the classical liberal rhetoric espoused by Robert Menzies fizzled out in the Labour Party today, at least with application to social issues, how well do the ideals relating to economic classical liberalism fare today? If we classify the strictly economic form of classical liberalism as an economic philosophy predicated upon the ideas of non-interventionism, free markets, the protection of private property, the ending of regulations, and freeing of trade, premised upon the idea, again, that the individual is paramount and that the government's role should be largely limited to protecting that freedom, well then we see that the Liberal National Coalition falls remarkably short of this. If the government is to be so limited and non-interventionist, job seeker payments would not have been created under the coalition's purview, or under Liberal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg running a deficit of $85.3 billion for the federal budget in 2019 would just not have happened. Seeing the total expenditure of the federal government represent 24.6% of the entire Australian GDP would just not be the case. Collecting tax revenue worth another 25.2% of the entire GDP would just not happen. Spending 8.171 billion Australian dollars subsidizing private fossil fuel companies, $2.8 billion on agricultural, forestry, and fishing industries, and a further $9.3 billion on, quote, other economic affairs, would just not be the case. This is not non-interventionist. This is not limited government. During Howard's coalition government of 1996 to 2007, the proportion of government spending with respect to the economy was at 22%, and under Albanese it currently sits at 27.4%. As such, while Labor has historically peddled greater government spending, the track record of coalition governments under Liberal leadership is not markedly different than a party who literally represents themselves as democratic socialists, even though they're social democrats. As a side note though, this is the laughable reality of two-party democracies. One party represents themselves as classical liberal while pursuing religious chaplains in schools, and the other represents themselves as democratic socialists while cutting taxes for small businesses. And at the end of the day, there is no practical difference economically. Ultimately, going back to the coalition, a government which pursues Christian ethics spends almost 1/4 of the entire value of the economy in a given year on federal spending, taxes another 1/4 of the entire value of the economy, can be classified instead as a conservative organization, characterized by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as being guided by the philosophy which calls for, among other things, tradition and social stability, stressing the importance of established hierarchies and institutions such as religion, the family, and class structure, and in the case of the Nationals, their influence is definitely seen in monarchical rhetoric. This is partially due to a similarity between the coalition and Labor again. They have factional differences within the respective party, and if the factional differences in Labor weren't confusing enough, the Liberal Party has 3 factions in further addition to the Nationals as being their own political party with their own internal political differences. For instance, Barnaby Joyce, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, left his own party when it was under David Littleproud's leadership, and he had a Joyce faction, in name only. There was no official membership. To clarify, the Nationals don't have official factions, yet political differences certainly exist within their party. Notwithstanding, the Liberal Party does have official internal factions, namely the National Right, the Centre-Right, and the, quote, moderates. While they are less official and organised than Labour's factions with formal memberships, conferences, etc., they are nonetheless real in their political coordination and self-identification. The largest of the Liberal factions, with current leadership of the party through Angus Taylor as the opposition leader, is that of the National Right, and they have regular meetings, policy alignments, and consist of the bulk of the Liberal Party's general social conservative thought. The centre-right was the largest faction during the Morrison government, with current leadership under Alex Hawke, who once said that nobody joins the Liberal Party to be left-wing. If you stand for drug-injecting rooms, lowering the homosexual age of consent, you can choose the Greens, Labour, or the Democrats. The moderates, or the mods, put forth the first woman to Liberal Party leadership, and profess themselves to be socially liberal, yet are the substantive minority of the party, so there goes that hope. Ultimately, when analysing the Liberal National Coalition, one cannot fairly or honestly classify them as classically liberal. The ideology of Sir Robert Menzies has long since fizzled out, and what remains in the Liberal Party and its coalition counterpart is a synthesis of conservative, Christian, and monarchist thought. The rigidness of a government which asserts its authority to artificially maintain class structures through government intervention in otherwise free markets and continue to pursue major religious institutional protection is a far cry from classical liberalism or laissez-faire economics. Yet it nonetheless more adequately constitutes the Liberal National Coalition to be a broadly conservative coalition. My. the social conservatives. At the time of writing the script, only a mere 24 hours previously had Pauline Hanson and her One Nation party won their 4th seat in the South Australian election, putting them just 1 seat behind the official opposition, being the Coalition, who have 5 seats. This is the main reason that I present One Nation as the third party in this video, as the most recent Australian political election holds them as, electorally speaking, the 3rd largest political party, at least in South Australian politics. However, the popular vote presents a further layer of intrigue, as the South Australian election revealed, so far as the popular vote is concerned, that they may actually be the 2nd most voted for political party at 22.9% compared to the Coalition's 18.9%, with the state's Labor Party having 37.5%. As it pertains to a nationwide outlook, the most recent polling of Australians by Roy Morgan, taken in the last week of March, illustrates that with respect to voting intention, 23.5% of popular support is for One Nation, contrasted by the Coalition's own just shy 22.5%. As such, there is an impetus on Australian politics as a whole to clarify what exactly is the ideology of One Nation. This may seem laughingly obvious. Anyone who just looks at their name and considers their nationalistic rhetorics. However, I will afford them the same degree of analysis as the others who in actuality are quite different than what their names presuppose. As such, a philosophical analysis of One Nation reveals less clarity than at face value one would expect, as this is the nature of a self-evidently populist movement. One Nation is certainly populist, with qualifying features being that of the constant us versus them rhetoric, which is a vital characteristic of political populism. Populism is simply defined, by Merriam-Webster's dictionary once more, as being a political philosophy or movement that represents, or is claimed to represent, the interests of ordinary people, especially against the establishment elite. One Nation presents themselves through their own social media outlets as being an alternative for voters disgruntled with the quote, Canberra elite. With One Nation having been established only in 1997, it is the newest of the 4 parties on this list. Academics already classified Hansomism as the so-called philosophy of One Nation, and characterized it as being a brand of xenophobic populism. As surface-level critiques of right-wing populists often see the label of fascism falsely applied, fascist within the meaning provided by Merriam-Webster distinctly associates the ideology with autocracy, dictatorialism and despotism, and tyranny, ethnic identity, religion, tradition, or in a word, nation. These core tenets of fascism are a fundamental part of One Nation's rhetoric and identity, with their name evident alone. However, One Nation can be recognized as nationalists instead of fascists, with nationalism defined as an ideology that elevates one nation or nationality above all others and places primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations. And Hanson herself has a vault worth of quotes evidencing this further.
To survive in peace and harmony, united and strong, we must have one people, one nation, one flag. I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished.
Yeah.
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Between 1984 and 1995, 40% of all migrants into this country were of Asian origin. They have their own culture and religion, form ghettos and do not assimilate. Of course I will be called racist, but if I can invite who I want into my home, then I should have the right to have a say in who comes into my country. A truly multicultural country can never be strong or united, and the world is full of failed and tragic examples ranging from Ireland to Bosnia to Africa and closer to home, Papua New Guinea.
As such, fascism can be thought of as nationalism put into practice by virtue of authoritarianism to a dictatorial degree, being a form of tyranny in combination with the belief that one's own nation is superior to all others. The reason to which fascism therefore cannot be attributed to one nation as their ideology, if we accept these definitions, is because at face value their brand of populism espouses against authoritarianism in a limited number of ways. Former member of One Nation, Stephen Andrew, wrote for One Nation's official publication a critique of the Commonwealth's COVID response, stating that, quote, "Bit by bit we are being transformed from a freedom-loving society into one that values safety and security above all else. We gave up our freedoms in order to feel more safe." And from Pauline Hanson herself, she argued in Parliament that democracies like Australia are underpinned by certain inalienable human rights. These include the freedom to associate with who we want, the freedom to travel where we will, the right to believe what we want, and follow the religion that we choose, and the freedom to assemble peacefully. As Thomas Jefferson said, external vigilance is the price of liberty. He was right. End quote. Therefore, One Nation appears to somewhat have a classical liberal dimension, which is at the background of their rhetoric, with nationalism being at the forefront of their identity. To further evidence their classical liberal characteristics, stating in regard to firearm ownership on their policy page that we do not believe that further stringent measures or regulations are required regarding licensing, and on the issue of separation of church and state, Pauline Hanson stated in a 2016 parliamentary speech that separation of church and state has become an essential component of our way of life, and anything that threatens that separation threatens our freedom. In response to the same-sex plebiscite sent out across Australia in 2017, Hanson said that, quote, "While I personally believe in and support traditional marriage and voted no in the postal survey, I also believe that the views of majority of Australians deserve respect." As such, Hanson presents a viewpoint consistent with democracy while being traditional and conservative. One cannot constitute One Nation as fitting the definition of fascism because at the end of the day, they do not seek to impose a tyranny. Ultimately, while Pauline Hanson's rising One Nation party can only be analysed through rhetoric and policy proposals alone, as they've never formed a government, in final analysis of their ideology, we definitely can rule out fascism. This is because they do not seek to utilize coercion or force to a degree constituting such authoritarianism as necessary to fit the definition of fascism. Hanson stated that we come from a breed of Australians who were taught values, morals, honesty, work ethic and common sense, things very much lacking today, evidencing social conservatism once more, further appealing to conservative-minded Australians and taking voters away, potentially, from the Liberal National Coalition. As such, One Nation can be understood as a national conservative party, adhering to a form of cultural nationalism that emphasizes the preservation of national identity as well as cultural identity, praises the family, is oriented towards upholding national sovereignty, which includes opposing illegal immigration or immigration per se, and having a strong military, while departing from libertarianism and taking a more pragmatic approach to regulatory economics, such as utilizing protectionism. Due to the rhetorical elephant often in the room with One Nation being the claim that they are far right, would this be consistent with an analysis of their rhetoric and proposals? That requires assessing what being far right actually is, beyond just fear-mongering. Using Merriam-Webster once more, the far right is defined as the group of people whose political views are the most conservative. And therein, for the intent and relevance of Australian politics, One Nation would be the furthest right, therefore being far right. However, as an actual ideological category, One Nation has some but not all of the features of a typical political understanding of being far right. According to William and Ninny Kerr of the Journal of Psychosocial Studies, there is an eminent, important role that nationalism plays in underpinning far-right populist parties. Further academic characterization of the term far-right often bundles authoritarianism with post-liberal thought, which is where one nation disappoints the mold of being far-right. One nation is not inherently more authoritarian than the Constitution of Australia emboldens any other government we have had or may have in the future to be, and even sees its leaders routinely uphold free speech principles by quoting classical liberal philosophers. Therefore, one nation is the furthest to the right of contemporary Australian organised politics. However, it cannot be said to be far right in the same vein as the Nazi Party. In other words, while Pauline Hanson's party can be labelled as far right, there ought to be no fallacy or false equivalence between them and other worser far-right parties, such as the Nazi Party, for example, as that would be a false continuum. Nevertheless, One Nation is certainly the most nationalist and most conservative party on offer, with a history of cultural rejection against Asians and Muslims. The National Conservatives. The Australian Greens, founded similarly to One Nation in the 1990s, and are thus also newcomers to the bloc, have been positioned as another alternative to the mainstream, but this time they draw votes away from their fellow leftists at the Australian Labor Party. Nevertheless, former federal leader of the Australian Greens would resist such a characterisation of the Australian Labor Party as constituting leftism in the first place, which provides an insight into how the Australian Greens perceive themselves. Adam Bandt stated in 2022 that the Greens are now the only social democratic party in Australia criticising the ALP for having adopted neoliberalism and, in his view, becoming far right. Important in understanding the Federal Greens Party is the fact that their foundation in 1992 was the joining of a confederation of member body parties from the state level, all consisting of parties premised upon ecological sustainability and self-identifying as part of the worldwide Greens movement. According to the Federal Charter, among ecological sustainability are the further objectives of establishing peace and non-violence, social justice, and grassroots participatory democracy on a basis that conservative governments lack the political will to make the necessary adjustments that will bring an end to conflict, pollution, poor health, and social inequity. From this alone, we can confidently ascertain that the Australian Greens are social democrats, progressives, and green, all conducive towards the self-identity the Greens purport. But what actually is green with regard to politics? Green politics is taken within political academia as being synonymous with eco-politics, to which British politician of the Green Party of England and Wales, Derek Wall, wrote in 2004 that there are 4 key elements of the original German Green Party which every successive Greens movement encompasses. These 4 elements were ecology, social justice, peace, and grassroots democracy. He further stated that green politics is first and foremost the politics of ecology, a campaign to preserve the planet from corporate greed, so we can act as good ancestors to future generations, and that ecology may be the first pillar of green politics, but it is not the only one. As such, the self-identification of the Australian Greens is, as far as rhetoric is concerned, by far the most accurate, direct, and candid of the 4 major Australian political parties. In addressing the Australian Greens' political philosophy, their association with international counterparts equally espousing the pillars of political ecology and commitment therein to the International Global Greens Charter, as well as their adamant self-identification as being that of a, quote, Greens party, would require quite a potent dichotomy of policies against such identity to illustrate any evidence that they are not faithful to the ideology of being green. According to their ambitious climate action plan, where the Greens criticises Labour's tenure having seen 25 coal and gas projects approved under their tenure, the Greens will instead, quote, stop new coal and gas and fossil fuel subsidies for all industries except agriculture, expand publicly owned renewable energy and native forest logging, seek to protect wildlife such as koalas from extinction, among myriad other policies. Furthermore, when they have been elected to local government, Greens members at the Darebin City Council became the first local government in the world among 1,700 other later followers to declare a climate emergency in 2019. Similarly, in Darebin, they introduced a 10% development levy to fund parks to be within 500 metres of every home, and other councils under Green's tenure saw the pursuit of net zero council emissions by 2030. So, to say the most obvious, they certainly are environmentally conscious. As such, when Andrew Dobson, an academic and member of the Green Party of England and Wales, further clarifies that eco-politics goes beyond mere environmentalism, clarifying that this is through a synthesis of the other pillars of peace/non-violence, social justice, and expanded grassroots democracy, the Australian Greens further meets this definition through having an expanded policy platform which pursues socially progressive policies, as well as the pursuit of an Australian Charter of rights, both for the environment and for humans, pursuit of welfare and disability care, and belief that all citizens have the right and responsibility to participate in and to equally access the processes of government. Within the confines of philosophic and academic definitions set forth by relevant sources, Derek Wall once again clarifies that eco-politics is when environmental does not come at the expense of the poor or lead to inequality, a position that places Greens parties as being on the left of the political spectrum, according to Wall. So, if the Australian Labor Party can be said to encompass broad leftist thought within Australia, the Australian Greens can be seen as capturing ecologically minded leftist progressives as a niche within the overall leftist sphere of thought, adding a further dimension to an otherwise social democratic party. The distinctions between the two major left-leaning parties is that while the Australian Labor Party appeals generally to the middle-lower classes, as evidenced through their extensive history of trade unionism, redressal for perceived economic inequities, and willingness to compromise, the Greens can instead be seen as appealing primarily towards environmental conservation, as we, in their view, ought to be good ancestors to future generations, as well as further redress to those with perceived social inequities and injustices, such as Aboriginals, women, migrants, and other groups, due to the added pillars of eco-politics necessitating faithfulness to serving grassroots democracy and social justice. As a necessary caveat with concern to an often applied critique of the Australian Greens, it must be said that nowhere in their own publications or rhetoric, nor policies do they classify themselves as socialist. While there are instances of class war rhetoric within the sphere of the Australian Greens by certain members, socialist terminology and rhetoric surrounding class consciousness, class warfare, or struggles is not in any meaningful way central to their party. Instead, criticism of the wealthy is almost entirely limited to the disproportionate amount that said wealthy people contribute to environmental damage compared to everyday, ordinary people across the world, positioning themselves as social justice progressives instead of socialists. In fact, the socialist alternative journalist Ben Hillier even went so far as highlighting that eco-politics retreats from the idea that industrial working class is the principal agent of revolutionary change, and that Greens voters are tertiary educated white-collar workers of the middle class, which encompasses both the capitalist class at one end and the working class at the other, and ultimately landing upon the conclusion that the Green solution therefore is not to end the system of class oppression, but to do away with materialist demand and to change our values. It should be noted that the socialist alternative does not have a monopoly on socialist and socialist adjacent thought in Australia. Yet their identification of the Greens as being not concerned with class warfare is the relevant characterization which separates them from the accusation of being socialist. And lastly, their policies do not outwardly seek to even get rid of corporations, instead imagining a world whereby corporate accountability includes big corporations and billionaires paying their fair share of tax, according to Adam Band. Before a final summary of the Australian Greens can be stated, there are two further dimensions to analyse with respect to their political philosophy, something which they share with One Nation of all political parties, perhaps just by virtue of being a rhetorical tool necessitated by being a newcomer to the bloc and alternative to the Australian political scene, a feature they share with One Nation. They are both populist. Again, restating that populism is considered a political appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elites, we see that the Greens routinely criticise both coalition and Labour governments, with one specific example of such populist rhetoric being that of the preamble to their housing and homelessness plan, where they state that, quote, both major parties take millions in donations from the property industry, and it pays off. Renters and first home buyers don't stand a chance. However, on the other side of the coin of One Nation, they are certainly not nationalistic by any stretch of the English lexicon. They would be rightfully characterized as globalists instead, being defined by Merriam-Webster as a national policy of treating the whole world as a proper sphere for political influence, predicated upon the idea that policy should be planned on a global basis, rather than serving the interests of individual countries. This is shown by their advocacy for Australia ceding border control rights to the United Nations Refugee Convention, explicitly seeking to base refugee policy on human rights and international law, not national sovereignty. This is because, as previously discussed, they are leftists, left populists. Ultimately, the Greens are the most honest, direct, and accurate in their self-identification. The Australian Greens are resoundingly green. The Australian Greens can be said to be eco-political, social, progressivist globalists. In other words, they're green. They're niche, but they are who they say they are. As part of my research for this video, I reached out to the incumbent state member for Yan Yean, Lauren Cathedge of the Victorian Labour Party, who was willing to sit down with me and have a conversation about topics within the scope of this video. Ms. Cathedge contended similarly that the era of two-party politics in Australia is absolutely coming to an end. However, she highlighted that the appeal of groups motivated by ideological and populist rhetoric ought to be thought as representing a bell curve of the Australian population. In essence, fringe political organisations, those in our democracy which are intrinsically bent on ideological persuasion, appeal to the fringe. The mainstream of Australia does not, she suggested, actually care about ideological framing. Instead, in her own words, they care about what policies help them to achieve the good life. Furthermore, while discounting her bias towards the Australian Labour Party, as she characterised the party to which she herself belongs as having the inherent value of helping every Australian, we were in agreement that the Liberal Party fails to contemporarily represent the ideals prescribed by Sir Robert Menzies during the nascent party years of the Liberal Party. To address my own political biases throughout this video, this is what ails me. I would consider the on-paper idea of the Liberal Party as being the best political option Australia has, or should have, with Australian liberalism, as prescribed by Menzies, being, in my opinion, the greatest philosophic set of ideas and values to forward our nation towards social and economic prosperity. However, the Australian political landscape of today sees the Liberal Party offer minimal consistency with their original message, views, and values. This is something Miss Cathedge recognised, suggesting, for instance, that the example of an originally Liberal-dominated voting bloc existing in small business owners is now only real in a careless stereotype as holding allegiance to the Liberal Party when they no longer. In conclusion, as the next Australian federal election is not scheduled until May 2028, we still have roughly 2 whole years of Australian politics to get through before we all cast our ballots once more, at the federal level, not accounting for state elections of Victoria and New South Wales that will happen between now and then. A lot can happen in 2 years. For instance, Australia had, across a 50-year period from 1970 to 2020, an average of 1.47 leadership spills per year in federal and state political parties. Leaders come and go. Policies, plans, they shift, they change, rhetoric especially. Yet the core identity of the parties won't be likely to shift all too much by the end of the decade. These are the parties as we have them. Labour says they are democratic socialists, yet they are social democrats. The coalition says they're classical liberals, yet they're social conservatives. One Nation doesn't outright say anything, but their identity is nonetheless clear. They're national conservatives. The Australian Greens are who they say they are. They're unashamedly green, socially progressive, and social democrats. There is no single comprehensive cross-national study which directly assesses the economic and social well-being of nations of these different political philosophies, and given the more realist approach to politics that is carried by the coalition in One Nation, only the ALP and the Greens can be benchmarked according to the success of other international political administrations with some degree of relational connection through associating, for instance, through the Progressive Alliance and the Global Greens. For example, one can look to the traditional economic successes seen during the tenure of the Progressive Alliance members of Norway's Labour Party to Austria's Social Democratic Party, among others. Yet they can also look to Germany, where the Social Democratic Party has reigned for over 2 years and seen nothing but recession and major industrial decline, and rising inflation and rising debt in the United Kingdom under the Labour Party. In essence, political discourse is often packaged with impudent smears of ideological rhetoric, such as decrying One Nation as fascist or Labour as socialist, which does not address the reality and often leaves voters emotionally rather than empirically informed. As such, I leave it to you, as the viewer with your own faculties, values and personal ideology, to navigate Australian politics knowing 2 things: what the parties are and how that shapes their policies, who they seek to benefit, and how that affects you. In addition to, as Machiavelli stated in The Prince, men in general judge more from appearances than from reality, for the great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances as though they were the realities. As such, always dig deeper, as at the end of the day, a one-sentence characterization of a political party will obscure more than it will reveal.